Chapter 35. Liberation Day 1. Ruka. The ability to blend into shadows was a natural property of her skin, but not of her hair or eyes. Lilac realized it before she did. The monsters that had invaded their ship were living shadows. Their vile claws could not harm Ruka because their shadows were blending into her skin. They had cleaved her silvery hair with ease, but could not touch her ebony flesh. Another Dareth on the bridge had lost their eyes when one of the dark fiend's claws tore through the Scara. Ruka had shut her eyes tight at Lilac's desperate urging. Ruka's Kobe-Tamj was no help. She could feel murderous intent all around her. The creatures had no physical structure of their own to strike at. They were unable to pass into the field of light emanating from Lilac, but the normal ship lighting or even high-power flashlight could not deter them. It was something about Lilac's knack that seemed to counter the very nature of these shadowy abominations. While close to Lilac it might be safe to look, but the creatures could speak into her mind, or make sounds to fool her into thinking Lilac was speaking. Lilac and Ruka had to rely on physical signals to let her know when she had to act and when it was safe to do so, which was terrifyingly often. The shadows were able to manipulate the corpses of the dead. These puppets were weak and fragile, but still wore the faces of crewmates that had served under Ruka for years. The bridge was too exposed. They stayed there until the shadows adapted. The damn things were smart and Lilac was starting to tire. Their only choice was to auto-jump once they cleared the nebula, seal themselves in an escape pod, and hope the creatures would retreat before entering jump space. Tyrell. The more time he spent around Lamentix and the Terrans who served with them, the stranger they seemed. He'd assumed the ship commanders were all full-blooded Lamentix. This may be the case in fleets overseen by other admirals, but not in Oleander's fleet. He clearly cared more about competence and making sure a person's station reflected their strengths. The odd naming conventions they used generally made it obvious which ones were the Lamentix long before meeting them. Their pallor and hair color were a dead giveaway for the pure bloods, but there were a few platinum blondes who had caught him off guard. The woman Oleander sent to coordinate with him after leaving for Hyrule had really thrown him for a loop. Her name was Blight Orwell, which certainly fell within one of the naming conventions. She was a member of Oleander's household but really didn't look the part. She looked like she was in her mid to late 20s, but that came with the territory. They seemed to just stop aging around that point. It was hard not to be a little envious. There was a faint hint of blue in her silvery eyes, giving them an icy quality. Her hair was two-tone and reminded him a little of Cully, but instead of silver and red, Blight's hair was pale blue to the midpoint of her head and as black as Gowry's feathers beyond that. Her build was interesting. She was a bit pear-shaped with a narrow, small-breasted frame, a slender waist, but broad hips, and the kind of rounded posterior that is hard not to notice. She always smiled at him when she caught him looking. Blight, despite her name, was quite charming, sharp-witted, and delighted in meeting new people regardless of species. Ziku kept following her around like a lost puppy, much to Tyrell's consternation. Having a one-on-one conversation with her was nearly impossible, which only got worse once Tro returned. The culture shock of dealing with Lamentix paled in comparison with the crew of the Ronin. One of the Karzon presented themselves as male, despite being referred to as part of a trio called Doloric's Daughters. The Terran who'd gone through extreme body modification to make themselves look like a cat was distracting and a bit unsettling. The feathered reptile and little black lemur-faced being were strange to him as well. Desiree was the only normal-looking person among them. Tyrell was just glad to have Blight by his side when they greeted the arrivals. She took it all in stride, treating each of them like old friends despite just having met. Tro didn't waste any time before sending the mongoose to the shipyard for repairs. The others just wanted to take a look around the station before heading off to rendezvous with Vikir's fleet. Blight headed off to make arrangements with Oleander's fleet to make sure they'd be allowed to enter the slipstream. Ziku was fascinated with the little furry black member of their crew, but just couldn't grasp that the posh eye was fully grown and not a child. Tyrell headed to his main workroom to make sure they were closely monitored during their visit. "Do you have time to talk?" someone said from the doorway. Tyrell frowned. He was hoping someone would stop to visit him, but not one of the Karzon. He silently scolded himself before turning his attention to his visitor. "I'm the ship technician," Maori said. "I was talking with our captains. We're impressed by your operation here. Do you use standard production contracts here?" "Come again," Tyrell said, then rephrased in response to their obvious confusion. "The keyrame belongs to Lady Darkseid. We designed some ships for the Karzon rebels and provided them with plans and prototypes. We're not a commercial shipyard, if that's what you're thinking." "Oh," Maori said sadly. "There aren't many independent shipyards left." "We're really not a shipyard," Tyrell interrupted. "We can design and build ships, but this facility isn't geared toward large-scale production. If you're looking for a new ship designed to your specs, you may be able to work out an arrangement with the owner, but she's more the pet project type. The war in Karzon space was just one of her projects. We provided Vakir with what he needed to build the ships on his end. He still needed to provide some of the parts and all the raw materials. Though the Cletharians were making their ships here." "No," Tyrell chuckled softly. "They do their thing, we do ours. I think it's better that way. So far they've only visited the station once. Well, with one exception, but that's nobody's business. Not even mine." "I'll let our captains know," Maori sighed. Tyrell always found it a little unsettling how quietly Karzon were able to walk. Back when there were dozens on the station, half of them didn't even have ID chips, never mind personal electronics devices. He made them wear bracelets with power cells so they couldn't sneak up on him. "Mr. Decker, do you have a little time?" Blight asked from the hallway. He took a moment to access the surveillance network. Zika was off somewhere else in the station. "Miss Orwell," Tyrell chuckled, "I'm glad to inform you Mr. Decker is retired. Call me Tyrell." "May I?" she asked as while stepping forward and resting her hand on the doorway. "Sure," Tyrell shrugged. They may not have had much time to talk, but she seemed far too formal. Blight stepped inside and pushed the button to close the door behind her. "Tyrell Decker. Private investigator, gunslinger, and cyberpath," she grinned. "I did a little checking into your background. You're almost an old cliché. All you need is an ashtray and a set of blinds looking over a city you hate." "Does that make you the bombshell that walked into my office?" Tyrell chuckled. "I've studied the culture, history, and literature of most sub-Terran cultures," Blight smiled broadly, "but I've never come across a bombshell in AB Cup." "I don't tend to talk about my gunslinger period," he smirked. "I never even told Cully." "It's a little hard to miss with that holster on your hip," she said as she walked into the room and paused. "I may be mixing my genres, but in film noir am I supposed to sit on a chair or the corner of the desk?" "I think it's desk if you're blonde, chair if you're brunette, and redheads stand in the doorway," Tyrell laughed, "but I could be wrong." He quipped, "Then again your hair is half blue, so all bets are off." Tyrell used his cyberpathy to add a few lines of text to voice code to the room's intercom. "I don't know," Blight said. "Where do the blue-haired women sit?" "Anywhere she wants," Tyrell grinned while thinking of Jean's blue hair. Blight leaned against the right side of the desk and looked down at him with a playful smile. "What?" Tyrell more said than asked. "Anywhere she wants." "Who's she?" Blight teased. "Never you mind that," Tyrell sighed. "I have to win the war, not just a battle." "Okay, I'm lost," Blight said. "I can walk away from you. That seems to make you smile." "No, that's not it," Tyrell chuckled. "Catching me watching you walk away makes you smile." "You never look away," Blight said. "I like that." "Of course not," Tyrell laughed. "I'd miss that smile if I did. Besides, I'm too old to start pretending to be coy now." "Don't let my hair fool you. My bloodline may be a little diluted, but I am a Lamentic, not a Lampharian," Blight snickered. "You should give up on the I'm too old nonsense before it stops being cute. You're what? 40 at most." "A bit past 50, Tyrell said. "Really?" Blight teased. "And you still have that dashing rogue look? A little seasoned but certainly not old. If I adopted your outlook, I'd have laid down and pulled the grass over my head a couple centuries ago." Tyrell blinked as if he'd just been slapped. "Did you say centuries?" Blight laughed heartily. As I understand it, you and Jean are both hybrids, Tyrell said. What makes you a Lamentic and her a Lampharian? So Jean is your blue-haired she, Blight goaded. Despite his best attempts to not react, Tyrell blushed. It's a matter of whether you're over or under the 50% threshold. There's more to it than that, but I've never had motivation to look into it too deeply. Oh, and if I were you, I'd watch the age routine around Jean. Lampharians only live about half as long as Lamentics, but she's still more than twice your age. He had no idea how to respond to any of that. I'm sorry to hear you're smitten with Jean, Blight said. What's that supposed to mean? Tyrell asked irritably. I'm sure this shiny bauble of yours would draw her eye, but she's the only cyberpath the High Court trusts with sensitive matters. She may be the busiest woman in the Empire. Is that why, with the exception of my ass, you've mostly ignored the women from our fleet? Are you too busy pining for a woman that just doesn't have the time for a little personal attention? She lives in the Bedlam system. That's not far at all, he noted. That's home to House Lavro, Blight corrected him. She goes where she's needed. We all do. Right now this is where I've been told to be. Well, not specifically alone in a room with you. I'm not as busy as her. I have plenty of time for an occasional indulgence. She'll be stuck in the cryo area until the current Colmion crisis has been resolved. That settled it. An electronic voice similar to his own narrated over the speaker. She was definitely trouble with a capital T and maybe a little extra in the A. I had no way of knowing if I meant anything to Jean, or if she was just stringing me along. He certainly knew all the right notes. One thing was undeniable, Blight was here looking like that. Tyrell smiled smugly. It might have been a little over the top, but his code worked. Blight laughed pleasantly while clapping her hands. Okay, detective, you have my attention, Blight said with a glint in her eyes. That was fun. If you're willing to answer a few questions, I may decide to give you more attention. Blunt and straight to the point, the program narrated. I had to be careful. She was one of those dames that don't take any prisoners. The sort that will grind you up and leave you for dead. Sorry, Tyrell said nervously, the software needs more work. I'll just turn it off. Wait, did you put that together on a whim? Blight asked. What is your rating? Greater, he said with a shrug. It was just a few lines of code cobbled together. Still going out of your way for a laugh, Blight smiled. It's flattering. Tyrell smiled to himself. If Cho saw that code block, he'd never hear the end of it. That little pink-haired flirt didn't appreciate how gifted she was. Her intuitive understanding of. The sound of Blight's boots landing on the floor startled him back to the present. She pulled herself onto the desk and sat cross-legged in front of him. Her skin-tight flight suit didn't leave much to the imagination. It made it a real effort to look her in the eyes. The program narrated, those big beautiful eyes. I meant to turn that off, Tyrell blushed. I got distracted. Leave it, Blight grinned. I'm enjoying this. If that's what you want, Tyrell chuckled. How are your reflexes? She asked. Gun-slinging, I mean. When was the last time you drew on someone? Actually, Tyrell said after a moment's consideration, it was the day I first met Lady Darkseid. Some Namdak was trying to con her into believing they were a cyberpath. I drew and fired 3 shots into that rocky head before anyone had time to blink. I didn't think Namdak could be. Blight began. They can't, Tyrell interrupted, not that she knew that at the time. She does now. I'd like to probe a little deeper, Blight said, then glanced at the speaker. She was toying with me, the software narrated before Tyrell injected a little extra data into the output. I couldn't help but think about doing a little probing of my own. Gales of laughter erupted from Blight. Birth records indicate you have one child, a daughter. Did she inherit your knack? Be careful not to get too personal, Tyrell said, but no, she didn't. Do you know if her mother is menstruum sensitive? Blight asked. He disabled the speaker before it could go on a long diatribe about his ex. I'm not even sure what that means, Tyrell shrugged. She doesn't have a knack and my daughter doesn't either, if that's what you're asking. Have you given any thought to having additional offspring? Blight asked. Tyrell laughed. I'm having a hard enough time convincing Jean to let me take her out on a date. The zipper on the front of her flight suit started just under her chin and continued all the way to her navel. She pulled it down half that distance as she said, I don't remember inviting her to participate in our little talk. Tyrell pushed his chair away from the desk and reached forward, firmly grasping her zipper between his thumb and forefinger. He maintained eye contact as he stood while pulling her zipper back up. Blight stared at him in surprise and amusement. Maybe you should have, Tyrell said while trying to steel his resolve. I guess I can't rely on that program to tell me what you're thinking this time, Blight said softly. I can't help but wonder why you still have a death grip on my zipper. She uncrossed her legs and let them hang off the desk on either side of him. Tyrell really wasn't sure why his hand refused to loosen its grip, why he couldn't look away from her eyes, why he was still standing so close to her. What was he doing? What was he thinking? Why was he kissing her? I'm fertile, Blight whispered between kisses, a few words at a time. If anything comes of this, my house will take care of everything. Just finish what you start. His ears heard what she said, but her words couldn't reach him. She walked out of the massage parlor hand in hand with Ogeron. He felt fantastic. This was one of the many simple indulgences she'd never been able to afford before. The extra pay from her new side job and the cushion left over from the terminal Tyrell gave her credits for was a huge help. Ogeron had bought her clothes, rented a room, and taken her out to breakfast and lunch. It had been a great day for her. A conversation he'd had with his wife earlier had him on edge. She could tell he was stressed no matter how hard he tried to hide it. The massage was her idea. It was cute how he tried to pay even after she told him it was her treat. He backed down after she explained to him why it was important to her. She knew he wasn't just using her for a cheap thrill, but he was throwing around money like one of those guys who expects affection in return. She needed to treat him to keep herself from falling into that mindset. He didn't expect something in return, and she didn't owe him anything. They were friends, and friends looked out for each other. The clothing was a riot. He planned on returning some of it and was upfront about it. He just thought it would be fun to watch her play dress up. In all honesty, her wardrobe was a little sparse. Cho preferred pants to dresses and skirts, but he picked a couple cute ones that she was determined to keep even if she had to reimburse him for them. That slinky black dress was a real killer. She'd only worn it in the room so far. It was long enough to hide her knees. It didn't matter how many people complimented her legs. She'd always been self-conscious about her knobby knees. They did come in handy when dealing with guys who were a bit too friendly for comfort. It had taken a little coaxing, but Ogeron had talked her into wearing a skirt before they headed out on the town. She preferred comfort over style, so went with a simple black top along with the gray box pleat skirt. It was a couple inches shorter than she was comfortable with. She made a point of wearing those scale pattern stockings and garters, just so she could convince herself anyone looking at her legs was just admiring the pattern. Driving Ogeron to distraction in the process was a definite bonus. I feel so relaxed, Cho exclaimed. How about you? Still upset but better, Ogeron said. Good, Cho smiled warmly. This has been the best date ever, even if it is with a married guy. It is easier without pressure, Ogeron noted. Yeah, she agreed, swinging their arms between them while walking back to the hotel. I've already met the service requirement to renew my citizenship. I miss my family, but every time I think about going home, there's been some new crisis. He continued talking, but Cho was too distracted. Just around the bend at the end of the street she felt far too many electronic signals. There were at least 3 vehicles and about a dozen people. She's probably long gone by now, Ogeron grumbled. I have no idea when it'll be safe for me to leave, but any way around it I plan to stay to make sure you're safe, not that I think it's needed. Something's wrong, Cho said urgently as she stopped swinging her arm. I'm sure it will all work out in the end, he said in a reassuring tone while clearly not listening. Don't worry, we'll have time to go on another date. How about a museum or art gallery next time? Will you stop talking and fucking listen? Cho snapped. What? Ogeron asked as they rounded the bend. That, Cho said angrily, pointing at the security personnel, who were in the process of cordoning off the street. I turned mine off during the massage, Ogeron said as he pulled out his tablet. I look at postings. She couldn't access the local security network without an access point. As soon as his tablet connected, she could use her abilities to poke around. Cho just had to be careful not to do anything that could get him in trouble or get her caught by another cyberpath. She was inexperienced at real cyberpath warfare, although Jilit and her senpai had shown her the basics. If she detected any active black ice scripts, she'd have to disconnect immediately. Using his tablet as an access point was a much safer workaround, but still carried some risks. Cho used his access key to take a peek at the area camera footage. There was a murder, Ogeron said. We must go around. I found it, Cho gasped. Was this my fault? Found what? Ogeron tilted his head. And how could it be your fault? This, Cho shivered as she played the footage to his tablet. She is Shamfarian. Her eyes are a different shape, her legs are not so long compared to her body. Her wig was the wrong pink. This girl did not look like you. It is coincidence. Things like this happen. It is sad but random. There is no audio. We cannot say why this thing happened. They grabbed her off the street and bludgeoned that poor woman to death. I don't need audio to know she was pleading for her life. Do you want me to add a voice-over at the point when she yells, "Please don't hurt me"? There is no need, Ogeron said. It's what you would expect a person to say. It tells us nothing about why this was done. It's not rational to blame yourself. Are you sure? Cho asked in desperation. If this was connected, he grumbled quietly as he closed out the displayed image, it would be the result of Adyarxie's actions, not yours. I know you're angry with her, but how is this her fault? Cho asked accusingly. The attacker was Irinarax. Most of them are with the parliamentary flock. Their worlds are close to where Acrididae dynasty was, before Cletheria had its way with our insectal faction. The avian faction tried to help their neighbors and had many losses. Cho's eyes nearly crossed trying to follow his acrobatic leaps of logic. It is known by my nation that she is queen to Cletherians. The military personnel stationed here know about you and her. Cletheria cleared out some of our systems, then brought back Calmia. People are angry and scared. An attack on you would provoke her, but an attack on someone that looks like you could be meant as a warning message. No, Ogeron smiled. Are you saying? Cho stammered. Ogeron scolded her. I said it is not rational. If a person was determined to connect it, it could be done, but no. I think this was random, and attempting to blame someone other than the perpetrator is not sound logic. Cho stood staring at him, dumbfounded. Ogeron rested his hand under her chin and said, I'm saying, do not look for ways to blame yourself. If you look hard enough, you can invent one, but that does not make it true. His tablet beeped just as Cho received a message from Kali. She rested her hand on her pendant while he checked his message. Kali was asking if they wanted her to meet them at the hotel lobby, or if they wanted her to send down Bruno to let them in the door. Wait, what the fuck was she talking about? Cho looked over to see if Ogeron looked as confused as she was. He was embroiled in a text conversation. It felt like they were using that strange, untranslatable language he frequently used when he talked to his wife. Cho didn't recognize the header information for the other participant. He looked up at her and asked, Is there anything you need from your apartment other than your clothing and terminal? I do have furniture, Cho snickered. No you don't, Ogeron clicked his tongue as he spoke. She put her hands on her hips and glared at him. Do you want to walk to the hotel to get our things, or should I ask to have a car sent? He asked. Just ask for a car, Cho snapped. Her mood had already been ruined. She worked hard over the years for all of her meager belongings. She felt like insulting her furniture was belittling all her time, sweat, and tears. He reached to retake her hand, but she ignored him. If it's that important to you, Ogeron said sarcastically, I'll let them know you'd like them to throw out all the current furniture and replace it with your own. What was he talking about? Cho took another look at that confusing message from Kali. It was sent from. She blinked in disbelief. They actually let her buy that old hotel. I don't know all the details yet, Ojeran grinned toothily, but they approved your proposal. So, it's really ours now? Cho asked, then corrected herself. I mean hers. It's been closed for a long time, he cautioned. I don't know what kind of condition it's in, but if you want them to move your old furniture into one of the rooms, I'm sure we could arrange it. What furniture? Cho asked with a blush as she rushed to embrace him. Desiree. The battle may have gone well, but the aftermath was where the struggle began. The fleet blockading the Due Star side of the slipstream would be moving on in another day or two. With the help of the mercantile marine outpost at Jacker, and Vakir's ship production facility at Kulkin, they should be able to maintain control of Carmel, as long as they didn't draw the attention of the major players in the region. Horrors pushed to liberate a second system so soon after the first could do just that. If the Cayman or Lupian world saw them as an upstart, expansionist, empire right at their doorstep, the Karzon would be conquered in a matter of days. Hoer should be arriving at Major in just over a day. Without the use of a Stargate, it would take at least 3 days for enemy reinforcements to reach Major. Even if Hoer took that system, his chances of holding it were remote. If he annoyed the Gorgalians, well, let's not even think about that. Most Karzon didn't have sense enough to know when to surrender. Baron Deloric had wanted to liberate his people for decades and had discussed the logistics with Desiree on numerous occasions. It didn't seem workable then, and she didn't expect to be sustainable now. Their current culture was still too prideful and militaristic. Until that changed, there was little hope of them remaining content with their own region of space nestled between much older and more powerful nations. To this end, the Baron had set up 3 sites for Karzon who had been liberated from their cultural dogmas. Jacker was the closest to Carmel. The other 2 were a Jahar between Kaylani Dominion and Midnight Fellowship space, and Jamek, which was clear across the galaxy near Alicia and Borgen. Their Karzon existed in a playground full of giants. Their survival hinged on recognizing they weren't one of them. Not being noticed had been vital to the survival of her species throughout the ages. The Karzon were so focused on honor and valor they might as well carve a target into their fur for the sake of convenience. Shortly after their arrival, the crew of the Ronin were invited onto Vakir's ship to advise them. Not long after that, Desiree was ready to strangle everyone on board. Maori was nervous about seeing her mother for the first time in almost 2 decades and wanted Desiree to accompany her, or at least that was the excuse used to prevent an inconvenient murder. The main bridge had a command chair for the pilot and a bench by a terminal for occasions when she was in the mood for company. This was Desiree's domain in much the same way as engineering was Maury's territory and the med bay belonged to Beta. Maori was unusually quiet during their flight over to the orbital defense platform. We'll be docking soon, Desiree said abruptly. I'm not a mind reader. Out with it. I haven't seen my mother since I was a cub. I understand why she had to give me up. I'm grateful that she was willing to let me go to save my life, but I'm afraid she'll reject me. I mean, she gave up her daughter and well, I haven't finished the process yet, but I'm not that. The Merc Marines call me and the captain's Deloric's daughters, but that's a title like the name of a racing team. I don't mind that, but can I just walk in like this, or should I swipe something from one of the captain's closets? Have you forgotten who I am under this skin? Desiree snickered. Of course not, Maori insisted, but I wouldn't mind seeing the real you again. That was a special occasion, Desiree smiled. You know better than that. It doesn't matter what form I take. The real me is underneath whatever skin I'm wearing. Just like you. Maori was the only member of the crew who didn't bristle at the Dujari way of speaking about the forms they could shape-shift between. After enough exposure to new Terran-shaped species, their resemblance would become another skin the Dujari could wear. Desiree understood why people objected to the term. If they insisted on being that literally minded, that was their problem. Notions like sex and gender had no real significance to her people. When shape-shifting, they were able to select whatever adornments they'd like as long as they're appropriate for the species they were mimicking. Her species wasn't well known, even on their ancestral homeworld. They just blended into Terran societies, doing all they could to avoid discovery. Desiree had stowed away on Baron Deloric's ship during his first visit to the uncharted planet Gelid. It was a major miscalculation. In the rush to escape the planet, Dizzy hadn't noticed how few Subterrans lived and worked on the Baron's ship. It didn't take long to be discovered. In those days, Dizzy wore the skin of an E2 male, and was known as Desmond to their tribe. Beta was the only member of the Ronin's current crew who was with Baron Deloric back then. When the Baron learned about Dizzy's nature, he was disappointed that Dujari transformation was fairly random. They couldn't mimic the look of a specific individual. In relative terms, it was like throwing a dart. It never quite landed in the same place twice, but you ended up somewhere in the vicinity of where you were aiming. After maintaining a skin long enough, they're able to reclaim that look whenever they'd like. Even then, there tended to be nearly imperceptible differences. Slight differences in eye color, of finger lengths. Things like that. A clank and whirring sound flowed through the ship as the docking clamp engaged. "Have we heard from Frosty?" Maori asked. "Nothing," Desiree replied. "She's probably still back in that nebula working on her ship repairs." "Why?" "On a scale from me to Beta, how much does she annoy you?" "Bobtail," Desiree laughed. "So she's fine as long as she stays out of your way," Maori said slyly. "I already talked to the captains. I've been considering inviting her to join the crew to help me with maintenance. We could ask her cyberpath friend to modify the Ronin so we can use her ship as a support craft. As long as it's after she gives birth and hands over the responsibility of raising her brood to her clan," Desiree shrugged. "I don't really care. Oh, make sure Bobtail knows he's not welcome back on the ship until he renews his 5-year shot." "I'll let them know," Maori laughed. There was no celebration, no fanfare. The Carmel system had finally been liberated from the control of Def Corp. Their personnel had been purged from the orbital defense platforms, and their remaining representatives on the surface were being hunted down by members of the resistance. Jerem sat in a chamber atop the soot-coated spire of the Firetail clan, looking down at the industrial district below. The black smoke that had bellowed from it for centuries had finally ceased. The council, which had long led their people, could now rule for themselves without needing the council or approval of Def Corp executives. She worked toward this goal for the majority of her life. Most of the population didn't know they were free, or understand that they'd been enslaved throughout their lives. The transition would be a long process. Def Corp was gone. More and more responsibility would be shifted to the people. Eventually, they'd become accustomed to thinking and doing for themselves. Someday, in the far future, they'd come to know this as the day they were liberated, but it would take generations to understand what that really meant. Hopefully, they'd be able to keep this gift Lady Darkseid had handed them. Next time Jerem spoke with the woman, she planned to seek financial assistance with building infrastructure the fledgling Karzon desperately needed but had been denied for centuries. They had not been permitted to build hospitals or schools. Personal communication devices and devices to monitor galactic news would no longer be restricted. Everything was about to change. It both excited and terrified her. She'd visited other worlds. She'd felt the freedom to make her own choices. The chains that bound the Karzon were shackles in their minds, which they called tradition and honor, forged by ages of alien propaganda. What was freedom to a person unable to perceive the chains that bound them? Miyako walked into the room carrying a stein full of mead brewed by one of the resistance cells. He handed it to her, smiled, let her know he was heading to the off-world trading bazaar, and asked if she needed anything else. He was a good kid but not a deep thinker. What she needed was someone to share this moment with her who could understand how she felt. "I have all I need," Jerem sighed. "Just leave me to enjoy this moment for as long as it lasts." "I never thought to ask," Miyako said apprehensively. "Now that we've earned our freedom, what do we do next?" "Fight even harder to keep it," Jerem said with an icy stare. Melfrey. She'd been unable to sleep, unable to close her eyes for more than a moment, without reliving the horrors of the day before. Flaniks were mind-hunting ambush predators. They lured people to them and toyed with them until they were of no more use. Flaniks were terrifying and crafty. She could feel its will tugging at her psyche, urging her to return to where it lived, and bring her friends to meet its family. It was a constant effort to suppress the urges it had embedded within her. It knew where she was. The signal was weak, but it was there. Even a few miles away, she could feel its incessant clawing at the back of her mind. This torment would persist until one of them was dead if the stories were true. She'd spent the night sleeping in an old model shuttle parked at Lady Darkseid's hilltop mansion. Yari was too broad to fit through the doors, so he slept in the storage area in the back. He was comfortable back there. She was able to feel his nostalgia, although he didn't have the words to express it. Melfrey wasn't a strong empath. She had just enough talent to soothe and better understand her patient's needs. She wasn't strong enough in body or mind to face the monster that was hunting her. Its golden laser-refracting fur was valuable. Maybe she could convince some of those hazard tourists to take care of the problem for her. Yuri was a strong child with a tender heart. Maybe if she asked him. No, that wasn't her idea. It was the Flaniks' unending hunger encouraging her to do the unspeakable. She curled up on the bed in the front cabin of the shuttle and whimpered softly, wishing for dreamless sleep. There was a narrow bed on each side of the room. They were the size of operating tables and difficult to get comfortable on. In the cabinets above the other bed were storage racks where vials of medicine could be stored, but they were currently empty. The cabinets above her were full of emergency surgical supplies. Melfrey got up and paced back and forth from the door leading to the storage compartment to the locked door to the cockpit. She hoped to tire herself out enough that fatigue would overcome her. There was a vehicle stored in the back where Yari was napping. It was some kind of tank, not that it did her any good. It was locked down, and even if it weren't, she had no clue how to drive it. The more she paced, the more obsessed she became. She'd spent years trying to save lives, but that Flaniks must die. Every time she blinked, she remembered the look of hunger in the creature's eyes. It felt like it was growing stronger with each step she took. Kiryu worked at a store that sold weapons. Maybe she and Yuri could help her. That lamentic guy was expected back sometime tomorrow to pick up Yari, so if she wanted help killing the monster that haunted her thoughts, she needed to deal with it before then. She sat on the edge of one of the beds. While out on the town, many of Kiryu's contacts had initially shown an interest in Melfrey. How many of them would be willing to march into danger in the hopes of impressing a woman they fancied? Melfrey yawned and leaned back against the wall. The data stick that Dr. Smith gave her contained a forged suicide note, which included a confession Melfrey's name on it. There was also an unaccepted bribe payment. It might be enough credits to get some weapons, but how would it look if she accepted the payment? Her body finally succumbed to the anxiety, stress, and fatigue. Bruh. It still doesn't fit right, Professor Nessel complained. That's because you're Lunarian, Bruha chuckled. That armored vest wasn't designed for your species. It was made for Taz Corp executives, most of whom are sham Farian. I'm guessing you bought it secondhand. Your body shape is close to a Terran, but Lunarian torsos are shaped a little differently under the shoulders. Is it chafing across your upper chest? He nodded. I was told you're one of the best in the field. Can it be adjusted? I'll see what I can do, but in the future, I'd recommend going up one size when buying articles of clothing with shoulder coverage which are intended for Terrans. It's easier to adjust down than up. She walked around the counter, took the vest from him and examined it closely. The inner lining consisted of Talgardon scales. She could tell from the texture that it wasn't from animals bred on a farm, but the synthetic variety which wasn't as sturdy. Her shop used natural hides which wouldn't match up with the cheap synthetics. It hadn't been well treated. Even the synthetics needed to be treated with mineral oil every few months. There was some telltale cracking. I'm sorry, Professor, but I can't work with this, Bruha frowned. Good craftsmanship can't undo years of mistreatment and shoddy construction. My recommendation would be to contact the seller and request a refund. I can provide you with an itemized list of faults, if you're willing to pay for a general appraisal. At a glance, I'd rate it as poor quality. It was sold as is, he grumbled under his breath as she tried handing it back to him. The posting listed its quality as very good. Next time insist on a proper appraisal before making payment, Bruja said. She could feel his doubt and frustration. Heftage, Bruja called to a male Ferrocene worker. Could you go ask Kiryu to report to the floor so we can get the professor a second opinion? Instead of answering, her employee pointed to the curtain behind the counter. Having a business partner who was immune to psionic abilities was helpful, but occasionally frustrating. Kiryu was watching through the curtain. Care to take a look at this? Bruja said while holding the vest toward the back room. Sorry, mistress, Kiryu said as she stepped through the curtain. I was waiting for you to finish with the customer. I have an important matter to discuss with you. Take a glance at this, then we can talk, Bruja said. Kiryu looked at the lining, then laid it out on the counter so the customer could see what she was talking about. It should be fine against horizontal slashing attacks, Kiryu said. The cracking is vertical. So, depending on trajectory, it might provide some protection from a piercing attack like a bullet, for example. Maybe more than one if the points of impact aren't that close. This flap here is supposed to snap underneath to protect your heart, but it's missing the ballistic plate. I didn't even check that, Bruja admitted. Good catch. A good hit will shatter the plates, Kiryu noted. That's why they're... Oh, never mind. This is a knockoff. There's no place to insert a plate. I don't know where you bought this, but you were scammed. Leather work is my specialty. This is a second-rate synthetic, and that's being generous. Heftage, would you mind taking over and help advise the professor? Hopefully we can come up with a replacement option that will fit within his budget. I'll do my best, mistress, Heftage said. I feel bad for the guy, Kiryu grinned. Give him a 10% discount on tailoring on whatever he buys as a replacement. Thank you, the professor said gratefully. Bruja and Kiryu walked through the curtain into the office while the customer was let off. Sometimes you're a real bitch, Bruja laughed softly as they headed to her desk. What are you talking about? Kiryu smiled. I'm a Cayman woman, by definition I'm always a bitch. Besides, nobody ever reads the sign on the door. They'll think they're getting a great deal when they get the 20% tailoring discount instead. What if Heftage still adds the 10% to the 20? Bruja smirked. It's just the tailoring, Kiryu shrugged, and we end up with a happy customer. So what's this important matter? Bruja asked, and how much is it going to cost us? I sent you the materials list for the replacement mask for Kali. I'm going to need your approval. I'll have to order some exotics, but that's not the important part. I need you to do me a massive favor, Kiryu said eagerly. Bruja sighed. She suspected Kiryu was hoping to deliver it herself, which would have her out of the shop for at least a week, or bill the material to Lady Darkseid's account. Either way, the answer was no. I know you're highly rated, but are you stronger than a Phalanx? Kiryu asked. If we need more fur to make slurry, Bruja said firmly, just order it. I know you love saving money, but it's not worth the risk. No, it's not about that, Kiryu said urgently. One of my friends is in trouble. I hope you're not asking me to fight it, Bruja scoffed. No, Kiryu said emphatically. She was saved from it, but I think it's still in her head. I was hoping there was something you could do to help. Do you want me to get you in touch with some mercenaries to hunt the thing? You can afford it, but they don't come cheap. They usually keep whatever fur is intact once it's dead. Nothing like that, Kiryu sighed. I just want to know if you can get it out of her head. She asked me if I could help her kill it. You go on a Phalanx hunt? Bruja chuckled softly. They're barking at the wrong dog. I know, Kiryu smiled weakly. I'm not letting you borrow plasma rifles, but I'll let you buy grenades at cost, Bruja said. When I told her plasma works best, she said no plasma, and she's never even fired a gun before. Phalanx fur was very flammable, which made them easier to kill if you didn't mind ruining their valuable coat. Melee combat against one of the six-legged highly telepathic creatures was ill-advised. She's a nurse, not a hunter or warrior. That thing has to be in her head. I know it's a big ask, but can you do anything to break its influence over her? Kiryu was on the verge of begging. I'm not sure, Bruja said. I know some techniques that can reinforce her ability to resist it, but without any idea how old it is or strong its mental powers are, I don't know if it will help. If it's young, I'm confident I can help, but if it's an elder or is able to reinforce its own will with pups, I doubt it will do any good. I'm just asking you to try, Kiryu whimpered. Please. I'll do what I can, Bruja said softly, but if you really want this thing handled on short notice, you'll need to talk to Gaorun again. Pass him enough money, he has people that can deal with it, but it will probably cost you more than just a few gal. They're not the sort I'd want to owe a favor to. He scared me half to death, Kiryu shivered noticeably. I didn't think it was that expensive to have a phalanx killed. It's not a normal hunt, Bruja said. You're after a specific target. They're not just some animal. They're at least as smart as we are. I've heard stories of a few mastering psionic transmutation. I doubt it. That would make them the only species, other than Kalmians, that can. The rest of us can only change how people perceive us. Well, using psionic abilities at least. There's a top-tier Kobe-Tamj ability that allows for limited transformations. I had to borrow a body with Kobe-Tamj once for a special project. Kiryu stared at her. It's a long story, Bruja said uncomfortably. I was asked to develop armor for Laika that's capable of shifting with them. It was necessary for the final stage of the project. Nasty bit of business. Don't ask. I won't, Kiryu reassured her. I don't like talking about my failures either. Bruja had successfully completed the project, but the result wasn't the sort of thing that she could risk making public. It was subdermal, utilized black tech, relied heavily on the lycotrope's natural regenerative ability, and involved a torturous, irreversible process which took at least a month to complete. Some good did come of it. Using what she learned from the project, Bruja revolutionized mutaphasic regenerative biofiber production. It earned her a few honorary degrees and a mention in the history books. Not a small feat for a woman with no formal education in bioorganics, chemistry, or mineralogy. It was just honorary, so she couldn't legally call herself Dr. Bruja Lee, but that just made it more fun whenever she was invited to speak at an event. Kiryu, one of the workers said as they stepped through the curtain, someone is asking for you. Hina, Bruja scolded, how many times do I have to tell you to use the store's formal protocols? Being a lamentic in no way exempts you from referring to us as mistress. We call our patrons customers, not someone. The woman had been brought on staff to help with matters involving leeches. But they're not, Hina objected. At least I don't think they're a customer. It's her Aram friend. She's here with that nice Jagaltim boy who helped us in the warehouse. Kiryu looked across at Bruja, lowered her head slightly and raised her ears up completely. Bruja nodded in response, then returned her attention to the saleswoman and asked, Hina, how's your counter? We're a little slow right now, Hina replied. Bruja shook her head. The other counter. Did you bring your brace to work today? It's in my locker, Hina said with a hint of confusion. Are you sure it's okay? Hina, Kiryu growled. Sorry, mistress, Hina stammered. I'll go get it. Be quick about it, Bruja said sternly. Hina rushed off. I'm worried they'll leave if we take too long, Kiryu said. It'll be fine, Bruja soothed. If there's a phalanx pulling her strings, she'll try to bring it as many victims as she can. Relax. We've got this. I forgot Hina was covering for Aya today. She's probably the weakest lamentic you'll ever meet, but she'll still be a big help. I'm a knackless bitch, Kiryu smirked. Let me explain, Bruja smiled warmly. Lamentics can use soul energy to counteract the effects of active abilities. I think they're the only ones who can. Kiryu blinked twice. Abilities can be active, passive, toggled, or... Bruja started saying but was interrupted by an exaggerated yawn. I couldn't care less about all that, Kiryu snickered. If it will help, that's all I needed to know. Next time just say it's a lamentic thing and leave it at that. Sorry about the monologue, Bruja laughed. I should be used to it by now, Kiryu shrugged while grinning toothily. Hina walked back into the room wearing a leather archery brace on her left forearm. 3 softly glowing stones were set into the leather, keeping them in contact with the skin on the back of her arm. The central stone was white with a blue gem above it and a green one below. "We need your help with a phalanx problem," Bruja smiled. "One got into that Aram's head. I was thinking if you can counter the ability it's using to influence her, I can bolster her will." "That's no good," Hina responded. "You need to make it think she's dead, kill it or scare it off." Nelfree said she thought she was dead for a little while. Kiryu frowned. "Trying to kill it sounds really dangerous. How do you scare off something like that?" "We'll need a good telepath schooled in the Darien tradition, someone who can establish a 3-way mental link and a Cheshire." "I hope you're not proposing forming a mental link with a Cheshire," Bruja scoffed. "The telepath uses thought imitation on the person under the effects of the phalanx," Hina explained, "then links to the Cheshire, uses mirror mind to force the Cheshire's brain in line with the person being influenced. Then you sedate or knock out the person the beast has targeted. Once the connection is broken, it will latch onto the Cheshire when it tries to reconnect. Then cancel out the mirror mind and the phalanx gets slammed with a skull full of Cheshire thought. We can distract the Cheshire while running the mental reflection. The phalanx doesn't have that luxury." "I've never heard of this technique. Does it work?" Bruja asked in surprise. "Yes, mistress," Hina grinned. "A half-hour of effort for permanent results." "Kiryu," Bruja said, "take my car. Go get Aya. Drag her in her by the tail if you have to. Hina, ask the A-room to wait in the break room. While she's in there, explain the situation to the Jagal Tim." "Yes, mistress," Kiryu and Hina said.